Brad Hannink.
Thank you, Marty Buck. Fellow students, open your Bibles to Acts 27. Acts 27. We're within one chapter of being done with Acts, and then, Lord willing, we'll start the book of James in a couple of weeks. So, Acts 27. God has promised that Paul is going to go to be a witness and testify in Rome. Acts 27 tells us how God brought Paul from Jerusalem to Rome. Acts 27 is considered a masterpiece of ancient seafaring. It reads like a ship's log. Netflix could make a flick out of this. It is truly a dramatic, detailed account by Luke, who was traveling with Paul, of this sea voyage. Luke records more practices of first century seafaring on the Mediterranean Sea than any other manuscript we have extant at this point in time. So Luke's purpose in spending 44 verses recording a sea voyage is really twofold. One, he wants to show us human helplessness and the all-powerful providence of God in preserving people through any storm of life. This is really a perfect storm. Number two, Luke wants to demonstrate the leadership character of God's man, Paul. So today, I want you to think about this chapter as a manual for how to navigate the storms of life. Many of us in this room have experienced storms. As a matter of fact, I would say all of us have. Some of us are in the middle of them right now. Let's pick up the narrative in verse 1. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in an Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. When we had sailed through the sea along the coasts of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra and Lycia. Now I want you to notice that Luke is now back to using the words we, which means Luke was traveling with Paul from Caesarea to Rome, and he was probably traveling as Paul's personal physician. If you know anything about how many times Paul got beat up, stoned, flogged, etc., Luke was his personal physician that literally kept him in one piece. Luke's other companion was Aristarchus. He was a Macedonian, northern Greece, but he lived in Thessalonica. Now, what's interesting here is that if you were a prisoner, the only companions that Rome would allow with you on the ship were your own personal slaves. Which means that Aristarchus and Luke volunteered to be Paul's slaves so they could sail with him. Do you love someone enough to be their slave? And I can hear you go, I'm married, stupid. What do you think I am, right? Yeah, but you're a love slave. You get benefits, right? I mean, but it's interesting, Aristarchus and Luke loved Paul enough, they said, we are not going to meet you in Rome, we are going with you. Later on, you'll see Paul say, my fellow prisoner Aristarchus. Interesting. So this is a demonstration of pretty loyal love. Now, Julius was a centurion, which means he was responsible for 100 soldiers. A cohort, this Augustan cohort, a cohort was 1,000 soldiers. So this Augustan cohort, interesting group. It was a special corps of imperial agents, and they were responsible to the emperor, to the Caesar, for communications and service between the emperor and all the provincial armies around the empire. So they were communication folks. They probably ran a spy network as well. They transported prisoners. They were really special envoys for the emperor. Now, Paul on this ship was probably the only prisoner that was a Roman citizen. The rest of the citizens, the rest of the prisoners were criminals. So Paul got some special treatment because he was a Roman citizen. The bulk of these prisoners were probably capital crimes that are being transported to Rome for execution. This was not a love boat cruise. This was a very depressing prison ship for the most part, because most of these folks were probably going to wind up being executed or impressed to being a gladiator in the ring somewhere. So it was a pretty depressing point. These folks needed to hear the gospel, and in fact, they would hear the gospel from Paul, as we're going to find out. Time frame now, we're mid-August into summer, AD 59. 59 year AD. Steph's going to show you a map of Paul's voyage. Way at the top, it's not even on this map, about 110 miles north of Ephesus. If you can locate Ephesus on the map and go north. On the northwest corner of Asia is this city called Adramyttium. It's a seaport, and that's the origin of this ship. And the ship is way down now in Caesarea, on the east side of the Mediterranean, and it's going back home. So Julius, centurion, requisitioned this ship and said, we're going to use you, and we're going to transport 275 prisoners and crew, and we're going to sail back north to your home port. Now, this was a pretty small ship. It's a coastal ship. It's a port hopper. It really is designed to sail along the coast, where the winds and the waves are less intense and where they could duck into ports. Back in the day, there were very few ships that sailed straight across the Mediterranean. The wind and the waves were too high, the ships were not that well built, and the harbors were too far apart. So they sail from Caesarea, which is just north of Jerusalem. I hope you can find that on the map. And the port at Sidon was about 70 miles north of Caesarea. So they're sailing along the coast north up to Caesarea, from Caesarea to Sidon. And Luke notes that when they arrived, Julius showed Paul a great deal of kindness and let him go ashore. He's a prisoner, but Julius trusted him and said, you can meet with your friends and receive care. And there's obviously a church in Sidon. It's probably founded by Jewish Christians a number of decades before, fleeing from the persecution in Jerusalem after Stephen's death. So it's interesting, they say that Paul received care. Amen. Don't know what that meant. He might have had physical needs. He might have had medical needs. He might have needed a travel bag. I don't know. But at any rate, he received care from this local church in Sidon, got back on the ship, and it says they sailed north, but they were hugging the coast. They were hugging the coast, and the winds at that time of year always blew in the late summer, early fall, from the northwest. So they're sailing into the wind. And the text says they sailed on the east side of Cyprus because the island gave them cover from the wind. So they're zigzagging, tacking back and forth as best they can into the wind, but they're sailing on the east side of Cyprus near the shore for shelter against the wind. They get to Cilicia, which is modern-day Turkey, the peninsula, the Anatolian Peninsula, and they sail west to Pamphylia. You'll see the note, Pamphylia, that was the name of a region. And they land at the port of Myra in Lycia. Now, from Sidon to Myra, it's about 80 miles. And you go, no big deal. Well, in that era, when you're sailing into the wind with the boat they had and the sail technique they had, it took them 9 days. 9 days, 80 miles. This is slow, slogging work. Sailing into the wind is tough. Just in case, if I asked you, I said, have you ever experienced high seas and rough waves in your life? Most of you would say, yeah. That's pretty normal, Brad. Rough water and headwinds seem to be normal in life. It's true. Verse 6. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship, sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days, and with difficulty had arrived off Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go further, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone. And with difficulty, sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, which was near the city of Lycia. Okay, here's our first principle. Storms are inevitable. Capiche? Storms are inevitable. Now, the point of Myra, the port, was often frequented by Egyptian grain ships from Egypt. Egypt was the breadbasket of the empire. And Imperial Rome had contracted with Egypt for corn and wheat. Those are the most common grains, wheat especially. And they hired and requisitioned fleets of private ships to literally go from Egypt and transport grain throughout the empire, wherever it was needed. The delta region of Egypt was incredibly verdant and fruitful at that point. And most ships, by the way, did not sail straight from Alexandria to Rome. You went straight across the Mediterranean. They didn't have the technology. They sailed close to the shore for safety. Steph's going to show you a picture of what an Alexandrian grain ship. This is a model. The centurion, Julius, put 276 prisoners and soldiers on this grain ship who had come from Alexandria and was sailing to Rome. Now, this is not a cruise ship. They didn't have passenger cruise ship, no Love Boat, no Carnival Cruise Lines. This was a commercial cargo ship hauling grain. Ships like these were generally about 180 feet long, about 50 feet wide, and about 44 foot deep from keel to top deck for carrying cargo. They were very clumsy. They were single-masted. They usually had a single large sail for propulsion. You'll see a little foresail, though, for direction. And you'll notice on the back it looks like wings. Those are rudders. They didn't have a rudder way in the back. They had oar rudders in the back, and they'd use them to kind of help steer as best they could. They were not very maneuverable ships. They were really designed, put the sail up and sail with the wind. If you've got contrary winds, this is a slow boat to China, as they say. Back to the map. They left Myra, and they're sailing west into the wind along the coast, about 130 miles from Myra to Cnidus, which is just north of the Greek island of Rhodes. So this is 130 miles into the wind. And the headwinds were so bad, Luke says, they couldn't land at this port, couldn't get in. So they continued sailing south and west about 100 nautical miles to the island of Crete. Now, Crete's about 140 miles long, pretty long island. And Cape Salmone is on the east side, the northeast side of Salmone, and it faces the wind. Very treacherous. So they couldn't get into that port, so they had to sail around the south side of the island, where the island would give them some relief from the wind pressure, because the wind was blowing from the northwest. So this voyage so far, you'll notice Luke is saying the winds were contrary multiple times. We sailed with difficulty multiple times. We sailed slowly multiple times. Does that sound like life? The winds are contrary in my life. How many, I get tailwinds occasionally. Occasionally, the wind is at your back. It doesn't seem to last very long, right? Most of the time, it seems like there's headwinds and rough seas, and so Paul's voyage is a little bit of a metaphor of what life looks like, verse 9. When considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there. If somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So point number one, storms are inevitable. Point number two, some storms are avoidable. Some storms are avoidable. Now Luke notes they spent considerable time at this harbor south of the island in Fair Havens. The captain was probably waiting for the weather to improve before they sailed on. Now, in the Mediterranean, between mid-September and the first week of November, sailing was considered increasingly dangerous because the weather deteriorated pretty dramatically from about mid-September to about first week in November. As a matter of fact, Mediterranean harbors were closed to all sailing vessels from mid-November to early March. The weather was simply too rough. No one sailed on the Mediterranean from mid-November to early March because there were these very strong northwesterly winds that frequently sprang up during winter months, made travel way too dangerous, kind of like the hurricane season in Florida. By the way, they didn't have all the technology so they could see it coming, so they just stayed off the water. Luke gives us a time frame when he says the time of the fast was already over. The fast refers to Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement. The Jewish Day of Atonement required a 25-hour fast, so you have to be a person who understands Jewish tradition to get this. In AD 59, Yom Kippur took place on October 5th. October 5th. It's already past October 5th. So Luke is telling you it's probably mid-October right now. And it is a very dangerous time to be sailing. And Paul is a very experienced traveler. If you read Luke, you read the book of Acts, top to bottom, beginning in Acts 9 through Acts 28, Luke records that Paul has taken between 11 and 12 sea voyages. He's not a newbie at sailing. It's been estimated that he logged more than 3,000 miles in a sailboat. That's a lot of weeks, months, years. He's very familiar with winter conditions and sailing on the Mediterranean. As a matter of fact, in Luke 11:20, in Acts, 2 Corinthians 11:25, Paul recounts he'd already been shipwrecked 3 times. 3 times shipwrecked. And one day and night he spent in the deep. They were shipwrecked and he spent 24 hours in the drink, hanging on to something. They didn't have life vests back in the day. You hung on to wood and hopefully you didn't go under. So Paul has got a lot of experience with bad weather, sailing, shipwrecks, surviving at sea. And he says, I think we should postpone this voyage to Rome until springtime. It's too rough to sail. He probably knew more about sailing on rough water than anybody on that ship at that point. However, money talks. The owner of the ship and the captain, the pilot, they want to get this cargo of grain to Rome because that's when they're going to get paid when they deliver. As a matter of fact, Claudius had said, we'll pay a bounty for any grain you deliver to Rome in the winter months because we have shortages because nobody's sailing. So these guys were really incentivized to take a chance. We get to Rome, we get a bounty, extra pay for this grain. Besides, the harbor at Fair Haven's exposed to the winds, and it's a really dinky community. It's small. And the crew, the sailors, they don't want to spend 3 to 4 months in a dinky community like Fair Haven's. And the owner doesn't want to pay to put them up for 3 or 4 months there anyway for the winter. So the centurion is the final word, and he listens to the majority. The owner, the pilot, and the sailors say, let's sail away from Fair Havens and let's go 45 miles west to the port of Phoenix, much larger, much bigger city. Here's the point. Storms are inevitable, but some storms are avoidable. Don't get into a fight with a storm if you don't have to, right? Now you say, well, how does that apply to me? Okay, real simple. When there's a hurricane warning and you live in Florida, what do they say to do? Leave, right? Board the house up, get in the car, and drive inland because hurricanes run out of gas when they get over land. It's cooler than the water. So you don't have to choose to encounter all of the storms in life. Some of them, when you see coming, you can choose to get out of the way. Here's a very simple principle. Avoid the avoidable. That's pretty simple. If you can't avoid a problem, for heaven's sakes, avoid it. These folks chose not to. Verse 13. When a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose and weighing anchor, they began sailing along Crete, close inshore, but before very long there rushed down from the land a violent wind called Euraquilo. And when the ship was caught in that and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. Storms are inevitable. Some storms are avoidable. Number 3, storms can come up suddenly. Have you noticed? It only takes one phone call to bring a storm into your life. Verse 14 begins with a word that most of us dread. It is the word but. Have you ever noticed that life regularly sends you buts? You ever get one of those? I was planning on this, but that happened. Fill in the blanks. Most of you could probably fill in the blanks every week with that. They were planning for a moderate south gentle wind, and they got it, but shortly thereafter they got a Euraquilla. Eura means east, Quilla means north. They got an east-north wind. That's called a nor'easter. A nor'easter ain't a nice zephyr, southern, gentle wind. It is a violent gale. Now, the highest mountain on Crete is Mount Ida. It's about 8,000 feet tall, and it's the source of a vast amount of wind activity that takes place. They can generate gale force winds instantly. And this sudden wind came up and drove Paul's ship southwest, away from Crete, away from the harbor at Phoenix. Now, ancient sailing vessels, they could not face into the wind and they couldn't tack very well. They literally just had to run with the wind, and they had to go where the wind blew them. And that's what happened here, verse 16. Running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables and undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor and in this way let themselves be driven along. Back to the map. They're in Fair Havens in Crete. They sail away. They're headed west trying to get to Phoenix, and the wind sprang up and drove them 23 miles south to this little tiny island called Clauda. It's modern day called Gavdos or Goza. That's what it's on the map today, but it's a very small island 23 miles south of Clauda. And they sail on the south side of the island. Why? To give them some shelter from the wind, which is a smart thing to do. And they use this temporary shelter to haul a lifeboat on board. Now, back in the day, they all had a lifeboat, a ship's boat, that they tied to the hull of the ship. It was like a dinghy or a rowboat, and they would use that for emergencies. But if you're in a major storm, it's going to swamp that. It's going to fill it with water, and it could also drive it in the main ship and damage it. So they pulled that lifeboat out of the water and secured it on top of the deck. Now, these grain ships, as we've already seen, were generally one-masted ships with a square sail. And if you only have one mast, you put tremendous strain on the deck with that one sail, main sail, right? You got this one telephone pole coming out of the deck. That's what holds the sail. And in a violent storm, that could actually split the ship apart. So one of the things they did, it's called frapping the ship. Now, frapping means, picture this, they take a rope, looped, one on each side, starboard and port, and they take the loop and they put it under the ship. And they bring the rope on the side and they winch it tight. I want you to think, have you ever wrapped a Christmas gift? When you frap a ship, you're wrapping a Christmas gift. You take the ribbon and you put it underneath, and you put it and you tie it, and it holds the package together. You do that with a ribbon or string. That's the point. And they did that because back in the day they didn't have bolts. They couldn't bolt the sides of the ship together, so they literally put ropes around this thing and they tied it together to keep the hull from splitting apart. Pretty dangerous stuff at that point in time. And when Luke says the shallow Syrtis, or Sirit, I would call it Sidra, look at the map and look at North Africa, where Tunis is. The Gulf of Sidra was about 400 miles south off the coast of Libya. These folks had no idea where they were. They were afraid they were going to get blown all the way south to Libya. And this Gulf of Sidra was enormously dangerous. There were sandbars that extended miles offshore. miles. And they were graveyards for hundreds of sailing vessels. So these gale-force northern winds would drive these ships south until they grounded on these sandbars miles offshore. The ships broke up, and you're not exactly like on the beach. You're a few miles offshore, so it drowned hundreds and thousands of sailors. So what they did is they took a sea anchor, threw it off the back, and tried to slow them down a little bit. And they also wanted to stop this rocking motion, so if you had an anchor from the back, you wouldn't have the boat doing this over waves as much. Verse 18. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo, and on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. Here's our next principle. Storms can clarify your priorities. Storms can clarify your priorities. I was going to say storms should clarify your priorities, but it doesn't for everyone. But they sure can. They were taking on so much water that they decided to jettison some of the wheat, throw it overboard to lighten the ship. If you lighten the ship, it rides higher in the water. 3 days after the storm started, they threw their baggage overboard. And they threw most of the ship's tackle overboard. They might have thrown the mainsail overboard at that point in time. And when Luke says with their own hands, it means they were desperate. Everybody on board started throwing stuff overboard to lighten the ship. It's amazing how a life or death storm can change our priorities. How many of you ever had your priorities changed by a storm? Yeah, I think so. The storm can take lots and lots of forms, but most of us have been there. Here's what's interesting. Selling wheat is what made them money. When they threw wheat overboard, they're throwing money overboard. You know something? Making money is irrelevant if you're going to drown. Right? The story is told of a wealthy woman, I think she was an heiress as I recall reading, on the Titanic. The ship gets hit with an iceberg and she runs back to her cabin. Not a smart thing to do. She looks at all her jewelry, all her gold, turns around, grabs 3 oranges, and runs for the lifeboats. Figured the oranges would probably be more useful. You need some sort of water on board. You're not drinking seawater, and jewels aren't much use when you're drowning. So storms can clarify your priorities. God knows that, and He uses them and designs them to help us prioritize the eternal. Luke says the storm is so heavy, we haven't seen sun nor stars 4 days. In that era, you didn't have GPS, sonar, radar, it didn't exist. If you couldn't see sun or stars, you couldn't determine your location. These folks were lost at sea in every sense of the word. This would be the perfect storm, and as a result of that, Luke says we were all falling into despair. That's exactly when God shows up. When humans run out of solutions. Verse 21. When they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night an angel of the Lord, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood before me." Here's our principle. Christians can be courageous because the God they belong to and serve is greater than any storm. Amen. Christians can be courageous because the God they belong to and serve is greater than any storm. Now, Luke notes something that's pretty obvious. No one has eaten. You're not going to cook food in a gale. Number 2, everybody's probably on deck trying to save this thing and keep it alive. Number 3, everybody's seasick. Have you ever been seasick? Have you tried to eat when you're seasick? No. Things are coming up, not going down, right? It's great weight loss, but it's a bad way to do it. So food's the last thing on their mind. They haven't eaten. And Paul stands up, he exercises leadership now, and he makes an announcement. And he establishes his credibility by reminding them that what he had previously said, in fact, had come to pass. When I first read this, I thought, Paul, you're telling him, I told you so. What he's actually saying is, I have credibility because I predicted something would happen, and it did. Now I'm going to make another prediction. Pay attention, because it's going to happen too. And this prediction is not based on my brilliance, it's based on divine revelation. He says, an angel of the Lord came to me and said, remain courageous. Everyone on the boat's going to survive the storm, except the ship. And you're going, how are we going to survive if the ship goes down? That's an interesting question. This very night, the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, underline that, to whom I belong and to whom I serve, sent an angel with this message. To whom I belong and whom I serve. Christian, you are not your own. You have been bought with a price. Christian, because you're not your own, you're not on your own. Because God always takes care of His own. Our Heavenly Father created us, redeemed us, owns us, and will take care of us. See, Paul was courageous in the storm because he knew the God who controlled the storm. So whatever storm you're in right now, number one, as Pastor Matt told us this morning, your view of God is the essential issue. God is bigger than whatever storm you're facing right now. And I know some of you are in some pretty painful storms. God is bigger than that storm. What did the angel tell Paul? Verse 24, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, Paul says, keep up your courage, men, for I believe that God, that it will turn out exactly as I have been told, but we must run aground on a certain island. Here's our principle. Courage comes from believing God's promises and depending on God's power. Courage comes from believing God's promises and depending on God's power. I'm very comforted here. God's angel said, Paul, do not be afraid. You know what that means? Paul was afraid. Verse 20 tells us everyone on board had lost hope that they would survive this storm. And what did the angel tell Paul? Exactly what the Lord Jesus told Paul when he was in Jerusalem at Fort Antonia. You must witness for me at Rome. You will stand before Caesar. God had already had a divine appointment arranged between Paul and Caesar. This phrase, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you, seems to indicate that Paul was praying for everybody on board, and the Lord heard his prayer and said, because you prayed for them, I will grant you your request, and all 276 of you are going to survive. Now, we're in the middle of a storm, and God makes those kind of promises. That's hard to believe. I'm sure that some people on the board said, right, we haven't seen the sun or moon for days. We don't know where we are. We think we're going to drown. And God is saying to you, all 276 of us are going to survive, and the boat's going down. Well, you're going to believe God, or you're going to believe your lying eyes, right? God was saving people because Paul was praying for people. You know what the message is for us? Never stop praying. Never stop praying. We have loved ones who are going, God, these people are so stupid, you could never get their attention. He got your attention. They're probably no smarter than you are. Did I really say that? I do love you, yes. He got my attention, and I know I'm above average dumb. So, interesting. Paul makes a promise that is verifiable. God said, Paul, all 276 are going to survive. That's a verifiable promise. We'll know whether Paul's God is telling the truth or Paul's God's a liar really soon. And Paul said, you can be courageous. You don't have to be conquered by fear because God said it, and I believe it, and God always keeps His word. Verse 27. But on the 14th night, as they were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea about midnight, the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. A little further on, they took another sounding, found it to be 15 fathoms. Fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat in the sea, on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, "Unless these men remain on the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ship ropes of the lifeboat and let it fall away. Here's another principle. I know you know this is true. Storms often reveal people's character. Storms often reveal people's character. Pastor Roger said over and over again, when life bumps you, what spills out of you is what's in you. Let's take a look at the map. Now, at that point in history, the entire central Mediterranean was described as the Adriatic Sea. They're not up in the Gulf. They're in the middle of the lake here, if you will. And Luke says the sailors figured they were approaching land because they heard waves breaking on the shore. Now, they didn't know where they were. In fact, they were at the island of Malta. See Malta? Malta is 476.6 miles from Clauda. It's 499.6 miles from Fair Havens. Now, modern Mediterranean navigators have calculated in a storm like this, if you are drifting, because the enemy sail, you will cover about 36 miles every 24 hours. 14 days at sea times 36 miles is 504 miles. I want you to look at the map. Malta is a needle in a haystack. It's a dot on the ocean. Malta is 17 miles long by 9 miles wide. The chances of you missing that island are about 99.99. You're going to miss it. But God used a hurricane to deliver them to the mouth of what we currently call St. Paul's Bay. They're 3 miles out. The water is about 120 feet deep. A fathom is 6 feet, 20 fathoms, 120 feet. Half hour later, they take another sounding, 90 feet deep. They're getting closer to the rocks. It says so they drop 4 anchors in the stern. Why? To keep the prow pointing toward shore. That's where they're headed. They need the front of this boat going toward shore when they get ready to land this thing. Now, the soldiers obviously didn't believe Paul's promise, God's promise through Paul. They panicked and tried to abandon ship. They were going to leave the soldiers and the prisoners to fend for themselves. They got into the lifeboat and they gave the excuse, we're going to lay out anchors from the prow. Well, you never want a prow facing the wrong way. You want the prow facing toward shore. That was a lie. And Paul saw them letting the lifeboat down and trying to escape, and he said to the centurion, unless you have skilled sailor help on board, we're not going to make it to shore. And you say, well, I thought God promised that everyone would make it to shore. Yes, but the sailors were the means he was going to use to fulfill that promise and get them toward shore. And so the sailors cut away the ropes, the lifeboat falls into the sea, which means they can't use the lifeboat to ferry people to the shore. That's a problem. Which means now they're going to have to beach the ship. Only where they're going to get to shore. If they hadn't cut the lifeboat away, maybe they could transfer people one at a time, right? Who's in charge here? It's not the centurion, it's not the captain, it's God's man, Paul, clearly. Verse 33. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you've been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore, I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation. For not a hair from the head of any of you will perish. Having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. All of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. All of us in the ship were 276 persons. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. Here's our principle. Storms can give us opportunities to serve others and witness for Christ. Storms can give us opportunities to serve others and witness for Christ. Now, it's near daylight. Paul's thinking about the well-being of others, and he gives us a very practical advice. He said, none of you have eaten in 14 days. We're going to beach the ship. You're going to need strength. Eat something because we got a major test to beach this thing and get on board land. Sometimes in the middle of storms, we forget to eat. We forget to drink. If you get not enough sleep, you know what you're going to crave? Junk food. That's just biological. If you're sleep deprived, you're going to eat garbage because that's how your cortisol levels work in your system. Eat when you need to eat. He reminds them of God's promise, and he says, I'm going to eat. He gives thanks to God. He's a public witness here. Gives thanks to God for the food. Gives thanks to God for their safety so far. And then eats. They're encouraged, and they eat, and they lighten the ship further so it can ride higher in the water. You want a boat riding very high in the water when you're trying to get the sucker to shore in shallow water. Verse 39. When day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. Casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders and hoisting the foresail to the wind. They were headed for the beach. But, another but. Striking a reef where two seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow, that's the front, stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern, that's the back, began to be broken up by the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. Here's the summary. And so it happened that all were brought safely to land. Here's our principle. The storms of life will soak you and may sink your ship, but God will bring you safely through. The storms of life will soak you and may sink your ship, but God will bring you safely through. So they cut away the 4 stern anchors, 90 feet of water. By the way, we think we've recovered 2 of them. Untied the ropes that held those 2 paddle rudders on the sides, lifted the foresail. They got a little wind to help them drive them onto the beach. They got stuck on a sandbar. When you have 2 currents meet, they deposit sand in a pile, right? They carried sand, detritus, and so they ran into the sandbar. And the ship in the back is being broken up by the waves, but they can't get the thing to shore. And the soldiers are very, very worried that prisoners are going to escape. Well, if you're a Roman soldier and you lost a prisoner, you inherited their sentence. They were going to get 15 years, you got 15 years. If they were going to be a gladiator, you got to be a gladiator. If they had the death sentence, you got their sentence and they killed you. So the soldiers go, kill them all. Just kill them all. Let's zero out the risk of any escapes. Take care of all of them. They clearly didn't believe God either. However, the Roman centurion, Julius, wanted to save Paul. He wanted to bring Paul safely to Rome. And he commanded everyone should swim or float any way, shape, or form, get into the sea, which is a little scary. When the platform you're standing on, called the ship, is breaking up, what choice do you have? I'm going to metaphorize this maybe beyond what I should, but have you ever been in a life situation where everything you were depending on, God is systematically smashing? So you will stop trusting it and start trusting Him. I hate that when it happens. I just hate it. I'm going, God, I'm not trusting this. He said, then why are you so upset when I'm busy smashing what you have your trust in, Brad? I'm going, Interesting, the ship upon which they were depending, God is shattering in pieces, and He said, trust yourself, trust me, get in the water. I would never jump off of a perfectly good ship. I would never jump out of a perfectly good airplane, unless it really was going down. But just as God promised, what? All 276 people were saved, and most of them probably couldn't swim. It was not a common skill back then. The salvation of all of them was empirical evidence that Paul really did speak for the living God who controlled the storm. You know why that happened? It gave Paul a platform for the gospel. They were on board that island for 90 days. We'll find out next week. 3 months. And I guarantee you that Paul presented the gospel to many, many, many people who responded about that. So when God allows storms in our life, He has multiple purposes for the storm, and it may be because there are people watching you who need to be saved. All right, let's summarize. I know there's a lot here. Hopefully it'll be useful for you as you think through. 1, storms are inevitable. Don't think you're special and you will never go through a storm. You will be gravely disappointed. Storms are inevitable, but some storms are avoidable. Don't be stupid. Don't be arrogant and think, I can handle this. I used to think that way. I got scar tissue from thinking that way, right? Storms can come up suddenly. As a matter of fact, most of them do. Storms can clarify your priorities. That's one of the reasons God allows them. He says, I want you to have an eternal perspective instead of an earthly one. Christians can be courageous because the God we belong to and serve is greater than the storm we're in. And courage comes when we believe God's promises and depend on His power instead of depending on our power. God put these people in a storm where they were utterly helpless. And God took hurricane force winds and picked a dot in the ocean and delivered them right on the doorstep where He wanted them. Storms reveal people's character. The sailors and the soldiers coming off looking really bad in this storm. God's man Paul comes out looking full of faith. Full of faith. Storms can give us opportunities to serve others and witness for Christ, and that's exactly what Paul did. And lastly, the storms of life will soak you. None of you are not, we're all going to get wet. We're going to get wet. And they may sink your ship. Here's the point. You're going to leave everything here. When you die, you leave it all. The good news is we have heaven to look forward to. This world is not our home. So the storms are temporary, but God is eternal, and He has promised us a heavenly home. In the meanwhile, trust Him, trust Him, trust Him. Amen? Amen. I love you guys. Now that you know, Danny.